These are a few articles from UncoveringLife.com. A link to the original article is in the description to this video. Article 1. Perception, another way of thinking about it. One thing that became obvious once I shifted was how the triad of seeing and seen no longer made sense when thinking about experiencing. While framing experience in those terms felt totally natural before the shift, it now referenced elements that was no longer part of my experience. But there's another way to talk about experience, a way more in line with what was now readily apparent after the shift. And I figured that I should write a few lines about that now, since this new way of describing our experience might even help somebody to shift if they're ripe enough. So when thinking about experience, don't think of it in terms of seer, seeing, and seen. Instead, think of seeing using an adverbial modifier. That is, instead of saying or thinking, I see a dog, say, I see dogly. In other words, you're not describing an object that you see, but you're instead describing the way in which seeing manifests. You're describing the way in which awareness modulates itself, that is, dogly. And taking it further, since seeing and being are one and the same, you're not really seeing dogly, you're being dogly. Experimenting with this new way of thinking about experience might begin to break the habit of conceptualizing percepts into objects, which is the apparent mechanism by which we're bound, and the dissolution of which equals total liberation. Article 2. The shackles of physicality. It's not that we awaken within a three-dimensional physical universe as an enlightened being, as a space-time entity who has had some shift in her perceptual capabilities. It's rather that the universe, including one's body, is finally recognized to be not a universe at all, but a mixture of sense percepts and conceptualizations, the non-dual nature of which suddenly become readily apparent in that moment of awakening, and makes it abundantly clear that there isn't anything physical going on. Physicality is thereby revealed as the mental fabrication it always was, and at last we're liberated from an imagined bondage. Imagined, because the whole problem is that we see everything through this fallacious model wherein we exist as objects in space-time, and therefore subjects to a variety of laws we have invented, the most prominent of which is the law of causation. And let's not forget the law of you must inevitably die someday. Upon awakening then, we're liberated from these constraints. No longer are we confined by such artificial bounds, because we now recognize that both the constraints and whoever is constrained is merely a product of that false physical model of reality, a model now and forever put on the shelf along tooth fairies, unicorns, and Santa Claus. Let me put this in another way. Every apparent thing, including the so-called physical universe, is reducible to our knowing of it. Strip away all the falseness, all the erroneous conceptual structure surrounding our experience of reality, and we're left with just perception. And perception is nothing but pure knowing. And there's nothing physical about knowing. Knowing does not have width or height. It doesn't have breadth or depth. There is no start or end to knowing. What you're looking at right now is knowing made manifest. And if you ask yourself how wide this manifestation is, that is, if you ask yourself whether it's physical, you'll see that it can't be done. I mean, how wide is your field of vision? How wide is your field of feeling? In order to measure its width, we would have to start on one end of the field of experiencing and measure against the other. But there are no ends to this moment. There are no borders to experiencing. We can't locate the left border and measure the distance to the right. There are no borders. There's nothing physical about knowing. There's nothing physical going on. And besides, in order to measure its width, we would have to do so within a frame of reference, namely another space, a larger meta-reality in which the manifestation takes place. But there is no such frame of reference. This moment doesn't take place in space. Where does it take place then? Nowhere but here. Article 3. Emotions. They're not where you think they are. After we've deconstructed the notion of an objective reality, it's now time to wade through the debris and pick apart whatever conceptual structures still remain that allow us to misperceive reality. One such notion is that of containment. We think that emotions exist within the body, but they don't. Feelings aren't in the gut. Look to your direct experience. Do you experience feelings as existing within the body? Isn't the body itself a sensation? Are there not merely some free-floating sensations present, some of which you call the body, but which themselves don't contain other sensations? Do you ever experience one sensation as containing another? Sensations don't exist within each other. A feeling sensation doesn't arise within another feeling sensation. A visual sensation doesn't arise within another visual sensation, or within a sound or a touch sensation. Our idea of a body, however, is fundamentally dependent on this type of grouping of sensations. As a single momentary sensation is not at all what we picture when we think of our body. Instead, our minds conjure up a multitude of sensations, visual, auditory, tactile, and emotional, that together seem to form the physical object we call body, which would be the object that contains all of these sensations. But all of that is only going on in thought. In reality, there is no actual container of sensations. The only real life referent we could have of a container would itself be a sensation, and sensations cannot exist within each other. Sensations are nothing but their experiencing, and experiencing cannot exist in experiencing. When we at last realize that this model of the body as a container of sensations isn't representative of anything in our direct experience, we can finally drop the notion that containment is a viable model of what's actually going on. Thinking in terms of containment isn't based on our direct experience. It's based on the universe model of reality wherein objects are physically contained by other objects. We believe that thoughts are literally in our heads, and that emotions are actually in the body. And these beliefs make it seem as if that's true in our direct experience. But having rid ourselves of these beliefs in the objective sense, we must now investigate to see if they match up to what's given by our direct experience. So look for yourself right now. Are thoughts in your head? Do the thoughts arise within the sensation that we call head? And are emotions experienced as being in the body? Isn't the body itself merely a sensation? Thoughts only seem to come from our heads because we believe that they do. But if you envision thoughts as coming from, let's say, the belly instead, try to put your attention on your belly and think thoughts, you'll see that pretty soon it starts to feel as if they do, which demonstrates that containment is imagined rather than factual. Thoughts seem to arise from wherever we believe they do. Drop the assumption that they're located to begin with, and thoughts simply cease to arise from somewhere in particular, and instead arise without being located anywhere at all. We also feel that the tactile feeling of, for example, our hand is within the corresponding visual sensation of that hand. That is, I look at my hand and it seems as if the feeling of it resides within the visual boundaries that make up the outline of my hand. But when I investigate closely, I find that this isn't the case at all. The feeling of the hand is merely a free-floating sensation that isn't located within the visual field whatsoever. It is just a thought that suggests it does. It's easy to believe when we look down and see our belly that emotions exist in there, but in where? That belly is nothing but a visual sensation, and emotions doesn't exist within visual sensations. Emotions exist on their own, uncontained by any other sensation, whether visual, tactile, or otherwise. By seeing that nothing is contained in direct experience, we gradually lose the ability to believe that we're actually experiencing objects, such as one's body, which is a giant step towards liberating the knowing of I am from being object-bound, to instead allow for the sense of being to expand and encompass the entire field of experiencing, equally and neutrally, as the sensations of reality in the absence of containers are clearly revealed as a unified whole. But moving even beyond that, we must realize that ultimately there are no sensations at all. Sensations are nothing but their experiencing. They aren't something that is known. But what sensations ultimately are is nothing but their momentary subjective knowing. And knowing is not something, some positive entity that is situated within a larger reality. No, knowing is all there is to reality as such, and it is no thing at all. It's a pure negative, the very absence of objectivity, and is none other than our own being. Not a being, but being. Non-objective, it cannot be known. Non-positive, it cannot exist. It can only be.